Next on Radically Rational, the podcast, we are now entering year 3 of the COVID pandemic.
True, but we're also entering the 5th decade of the war against AIDS. It is a war that has not been won yet, but must be won.
Coming up, a no-holds-barred conversation with an AIDS warrior who's also an AIDS survivor.
Hello again, and welcome to this episode of Radically Rational, the podcast at Radically Rational. We're bringing facts back into fashion. We are trying like heck to make simple sanity sexy again. And if we fail, we're going to get slapped around by an 8-year-old girl.
That's just not logical.
You better believe that I listen to anything my granddaughter tells me. My name is Paul Alexander. This is my friend and partner, Anthony Pittman.
Good to see you, Paul.
It is a pleasure to see you. And the subject matter that we're dealing with today, it was interesting to me that it resonated with both of us instantly. We're going to be talking about AIDS, and AIDS, unfortunately, is not a relic of the 1980s. It remains a pressing problem. It is one that has, in many ways, been swept under the rug. Other things have come into the windshield, most notably the COVID pandemic.
Yep.
But this is a critically important issue that must be addressed and must be solved. And we are delighted and honored to welcome to the program an AIDS activist and an AIDS survivor, Jax Kelly, whose story is a fascinating one. Jax, first of all, it's a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for being here with us on Radically Rational.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your bio is absolutely fascinating, and I will tell you how Jax and I kind of got hooked up because it's kind of a fascinating story itself. But give us an idea, Jax, about your bio and what you've done. I know that you're an attorney. I know that you are a financial expert. I know that you're accomplished in any number of fields. Why did this become so important to you?
Well, HIV/AIDS affected me personally. I was diagnosed with HIV in 2006. And I was in Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles with 44 T cells. So I had been tested regularly for a number of years before then. I mean, once we had testing, but I got complacent, and what I thought was a cold or a flu ended up being pneumonia. So and it was shocking. And after I recovered from it, and it took a long time, I must have lost like 30 to 40 pounds. And a lot of my physical capabilities. After I recovered from all that, I really found that being in part of AIDS service organizations was really important to me.
Jax, for those who don't know, in regards to your health at that point, when you mentioned you were in Cedars-Sinai Hospital, you said you had 44 T cells. What does that mean?
Well, anybody who has less than 200 T cells and has an opportunistic infection like I had, which was pneumonia, is diagnosed with AIDS. So we're all people who are HIV infected by the virus HIV. We're not necessarily diagnosed with AIDS. It would take, first of all, the viral load to go below 200, and then you'd have to have an opportunistic infection. But nowadays, because of medications, most people, when they actually test positive, oftentimes the medications, like they did in my case, can actually bring the viral load down to undetectable and bring my T cell count back up. So I probably would think that, at least in the United States, the diagnosis of AIDS is less frequent than it was certainly during the plague years.
In your personal experience, give us a chronology of what has happened to you and with your attitudes and with your health since you were first diagnosed.
Well, I'd go back a little bit further than that because, when I was in college, that was when we first found out about this strange disease that was happening to gay people back in 1981, and the CDC reported that in what was called the MMWR, still is called that. And at that time, I think I was still thinking about, when I'm most people in their college years are probably at their height of their sexual prowess, right? So as a gay man, I'm like thinking, well, at least I don't have to worry about getting anybody pregnant. But at the same time, when you have this disease running around, you're starting to think, well, what could happen? And it turned out that it was certainly a life-threatening disease. Most people, when they were diagnosed back in the 80s, felt it was a diagnosis was a death sentence. So it really caused a lot of caution among my peers at the time. So by the time in the 90s rolled along, I was actually, I had a partner who felt that he probably was going to be diagnosed with HIV, but he waited a couple of years. We were practicing safer sex back then, and he was diagnosed. So this was before medications came out. So it almost gave me the impression, I was always thinking back then that maybe I could be an AIDS widow. But fortunately, by 95, 96, we did have medications that were far more effective than the first few ones that we had, and turned around to make HIV a chronic disease in this country.
In 1992, the day that your partner told you that he was infected with the virus, what was the first thing that went through your mind?
Well, just to support him, because I think we both thought that he might be, infected. And infected is really the bad word, but that he might have the virus.
Okay.
And but we were hopeful. I mean, he didn't appear sick or ill, and there were some experimental treatments at that time.
Interesting. You mentioned the treatments that are available then and are available now. And I think there is this perception, and I'm not saying it's totally invalid, that this is a controllable disease that we don't really have to worry about anymore. That must be very frustrating to you. Give us an idea. What should we know? What is the most important issue remaining regarding the fight against AIDS at this point?
Well, right now, we still have 43 million people globally living with HIV. And in this country, we have a little over a million people who are living with HIV. So it's not going away. We don't have a cure. We don't have a vaccine. So the problem here in this country is that we do have pockets where there are new infections that are happening. And we've also learned that if you're like myself, if your viral load goes down to undetectable, then you do not have the possibility of transmitting the disease to another person. So until we get a vaccine, one of the goals is to actually get everybody who is known to have HIV to get them on medications and make them undetectable so that we have no new infections.
By the way, you were such a gentleman. You made a very gentle distinction a minute ago without throwing it back in my face, which I really appreciate. The issue here is HIV infection. And what we're trying to do is keep that infection from crossing the threshold into AIDS. And I really appreciate the fact you addressed that.
Yeah. And so right now we've got about, out of the more than 1 million people who are living with HIV, the government thinks that about 13% of those people are unaware of their HIV status. So it's those folks who we're most concerned about because they're more likely to pass on HIV to other people. And until we do get a vaccine or a cure, this disease is going to continue.
Jax, within the Black and brown communities, is this still, I hate to say this, is this still a taboo topic? Do we not discuss it enough?
Well, if you think about it, one of the primary ways that you can get HIV is through sex. And I think America has always had an issue about talking frankly about sex. So, until we get to that point where we can have more frank conversations But it really is. It's hopeful. I mean, one time there was a couple of years ago, I was in South Los Angeles at a women and girls HIV/AIDS awareness event, and this was an event where grandmothers and mothers and daughters were all showing up in support and trying to educate young girls about HIV in the Black community. So that's not a population that's really at the forefront of new infections. It's largely Black and brown gay men, men who are having sex with men. But the awareness and being able to talk about it in the Black community is so important to actually reduce stigma and to actually have better health outcomes.
It would just seem like, and you're on the front lines doing a lot of this hard work, that within the community, it would almost be frustrating that we're not talking about it enough.
Well, there's a lot of frustration on many levels in HIV. So you pick your battles. So, but I do remember in the early days, back in '91, I was on the board of directors for a group called the Upper Room AIDS Ministry, where we were helping mostly homeless and drug addicted people who were living in Harlem, New York. And one of the big issues for us then was to actually get the assistance of the Black clergy in Harlem. So, and that was really affected largely by a leader named by the name of Pernessa Seal, who I had the pleasure of serving with on that board, who had started a week of healing that was became very popular within the Black religious community in Harlem, and still is to this day. There's still an event.
We're now entering our 5th decade, if we can believe that, in our fight against HIV. You've seen so many changes, but Jax, at this point, in your mind, based on your experience, what is the most frustrating thing here right now? What remains to be done? What should be priority number one? And if we're missing the boat, where are we missing the boat? Well,
there's a lot of hope, for one thing. There's some new medications that are coming out. So, and ones that will help bridge some important gaps. One of the problems we have is adherence to medications. So if we have medications that you only have to take once a month and maybe less often than that, those are going to be great big advances. So right now for me, my big focus is on HIV and aging, because when we first encountered this disease 30 years, 40 years ago, the expectation was that nobody was going to be aging with HIV, that we would not survive. And so now we have a significant population. As a matter of fact, already more than half of the people in this country who are living with HIV are over the age of 50. So there's a need to actually start integrating people who are HIV positive into the aging community. And it's very difficult because of the stigma and also ageism that has been rampant in this country and most other places for a long time. But it's a new battle. So if you have an HIV positive gay man who has already gone through the process of coming out, they may be Black or brown, so they've experienced racism. They've had to deal with intersectionality, and now they're actually, after they've kind of gotten to a kind of peace about HIV stigma, now they have to evolve as an aging person and deal with ageism. And frankly, for a lot of folks, when they reach 50 to 60 years of age, they've fought that fight. They're kind of weary. And so the battle is really to re-energize our people who are aging with HIV, to make sure that they're included in the services that are available to aging people across this country.
All right, now it crosses my mind that with so much talk about mental health these days, you're dealing with HIV, many people out there dealing with HIV, black and brown communities, racism, discrimination, ageism. It's coming at you from all angles. When you speak to someone directly, how do you give them hope when so much pressure is coming down on them?
I think the big thing for our community of people living with HIV, the word that just resonates with me over and over again is resiliency. If there are any people who understand how it feels to keep coming back and living their life to its fullest, I think probably it's people that I live with in the HIV community every day. And resiliency is such a big part of it. So I go back to finding those sources of resiliency in the lives of the people that I talk to and have them tap into it once more. And I think that gives them more hope.
Our guest is HIV/AIDS activist and survivor Jax Kelly. We're really fortunate to have him on the program. We use the term AIDS activist or HIV activist. What form does that take for you right now? What's a typical week like for you?
Well, geez, that's interesting. Because right now I'm particularly challenged by getting a master's degree at USC and a master's in public health. So I'm halfway through it. I've still got 2 semesters to go. So I think for me, I'm also trying to use what I'm learning in my class to propel what I've been doing in the community. So for example, this summer, I'll be working with a group in Cleveland, Ohio, to establish a kind of a community stakeholders group for people aging with HIV. There are times when in my classes, when I'm doing writing assignments, that I actually inform people about what's going on with HIV and aging. I run a not-for-profit that's called Let's Kick Ass Palm Springs, which is devoted to people who were witnesses to the plague years. I'm involved with a number of community advisory boards, both nationally and regionally. And so there's always something cooking that I'm working on that has something to do with HIV.
Now, this podcast is called Radically Rational for good reason. We talk a lot about politics. Do politics at different levels get in the way right now of an HIV cure or vaccine?
I don't know if it's always on the radar, let's put it that way. And there are a number of groups that are very effective, like AIDS United, in terms of doing that kind of advocacy work on a political level, especially in Washington, D.C. Here in California, I serve on a group that doesn't do direct advocacy, but we're a community advisory board. Yes, there's always issues that are coming up. One that actually surprised me this past year was a HIV and aging legislation that passed in California called SB 258. And what it did was it actually identified for the Department of Aging in the state of California, HIV positive people as a special population of consideration. So that just changed the game as far as my advocacy was concerned, because there was always this silos between, I think, the Department of Health, which deals with HIV positive people, and the Department of Aging, which deals with aging people. And my agenda actually kind of, straddles both of them. So to have this act passed in our state legislature and signed by Governor Newsom was really a game changer for me. So yes, politics comes in there a lot. We don't see the vitriol, I don't think, as much as we might have seen back in the early days of the plague years, where there was a lot of demonstrations and I guess more newsworthy events. I guess Paul was actually kind of considering whether or not at one point, HIV/AIDS might have fallen out of the attention span of the public. I think At some point, we probably did, if for no other reason as we kind of the disease, the illness actually migrated into a chronic condition. So there's something about, when you go to the emergency room and you have a tummy ache, you're going to be waiting instead of the person who's sitting there with a heart attack. So we moved, I think, from the heart attack to the tummy ache. But it's such an impactful disease for so many people that the attention really still needs to be focused there.
Jax, you have lived such an interesting life, and you have accepted challenge after challenge. Ivy League educated, attorney, financial expert. I'm wondering, when you look back on the past 4 decades, how has the issue and the war against AIDS and HIV altered the life course you thought you were going to live?
Well, as I said, it really started in college, right? So my expectations as a young gay man totally changed once I knew what HIV/AIDS was. So yeah, and it's evolved. I think for most gay people, the HIV/AIDS crisis was transformative because it created an opportunity, if not an absolute need, for so many of us to come out of the closet, to actually identify who we were, and that became the impetus, I think, for the marriage equality movement for gay people. It created an atmosphere where people started to acknowledge publicly that they knew people who were gay, that they were in their families, they were their aunts and uncles and sometimes mothers and fathers. And so it created a sea change. Out of a crisis came a sea change in American opinions about gay people. So I guess as much as there was some bad in it, there was some positive that came out of it as well.
I'm going to assume you've spoken at events, talked to people, been on podcasts, done news events, whatever it might be, and someone's come up to you afterward and said, you know what? I haven't done squat in the fight against AIDS. What can I do today? If you've ever received that question before, how have you answered it?
Well, usually I would say, because for the last number of years I've been running a nonprofit, I'd say, well, we need more volunteers.
Gotcha.
Come to a meeting and we'll put you to work. But generally, I think again, it has to do with probably going back to probably asking the person, well, how has HIV/AIDS affected you? There are so many people who may not think about it, but they might have had somebody in their family who passed away during the plague years, or know of somebody who was a doctor or a nurse who was there then, or doing some of those services today. So I remember when I opened up a bank account for Let's Kick Ass, we were changing our banking relationship, and the manager who was helping me said that she actually volunteered by going to a local AIDS walk. So sometimes there's just public events that people can get involved with to help. And certainly if somebody wanted to donate to Let's Kick Ass Palm Springs, I'd be very happy to accept their donation as well.
Okay, this is interesting and fun and very gratifying. Here's how Jax and I got in contact with each other to begin with. Years ago, my wife worked with Jax in a financial advisory capacity in Southern California. They became fast friends. And you should know that my wife is actually the president of Radically Rational LLC, and that's the truth. So we have conversations about content and what we want to talk about and who we want to have on the program. And I'm not going to say that she recommended you. She demanded that we pursue this, which I was happy to do. It was great. And this is what I thought was so cool about you, Jax. I mean, obviously, we vet people for the show. We want to make sure that our guests are a good fit for the show. But the thing was, you vetted me way harder than I vetted you, and I respected the heck out of that.
Well, I don't know. It's actually, I shouldn't have vetted you so hard, except for the fact that, sometimes, especially since Joe would be a great person to recommend people for me, but sometimes media doesn't get it. There are some times when they might not be so aware of the vernacular. I know I mess up things myself sometimes, and sometimes journalists have a different agenda. So I just maybe that's why I'm a little querulous.
I thought it was great. Absolutely.
That's such a good point, though.
I wish everybody approached it.
Such a good point that sometimes the media doesn't get it. I mean, we're both in the media, and how often? Well, Jax, I'll ask you this question. How disappointing is it that you might see a media member just turn the quick story for the day? They do that little 1 minute to 90-second piece, and then there's no follow-up. Do you ever throw your hands up like, hey, come on now, there's more to this than just the story on Tuesday?
Well, no, I mean, I understand it. I mean, among the other things I've studied in my life, I did study journalism a bit when I was.
What have you not
school.
studied? My goodness.
Is that right?
So I know a little bit about what the storylines are used to, what gets audience attention. So I respect that. I mean, it's a business. So, but the challenge of somebody like me, when you get those 90 seconds, is to make sure that you get your message across as best as you can.
A big part of this show and its concept is media criticism. And we want to make sure that we're forthright about that. As Anthony mentioned, Pitt and I both have an extensive background in media. We are not at all blind to media flaws and media shortcomings. And Anthony in particular, I would say near the top of the list is that as journalists, we're generally like 5-pound bass in a stock tank. We're going to hit the first shiny thing we see and then get away from it and hit the next shiny thing we see. And that's pretty hard to defend.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I want to know, though, Jax, you're all about positivity. I can tell this. Without a doubt, you're about positivity. On the horizon, give me a level of hope. What should I look for in this battle over the horizon?
Yeah, so I get discouraged sometimes. I mean, yeah, I'm a very hopeful person, but there's sometimes I get discouraged because my recent battle, as I was mentioning, was really trying to connect the two silos of aging and HIV. So sometimes getting in working with the bureaucracy, whether it's local or state government, gets to be a little bit daunting. I think, where do I get there's two things that I think guide me. I think one of the things that guides me is the idea that we should be always learning, right? Because I think we can't really be empathetic to what's going on in other people's lives unless we try to learn what's going on in other people's lives. So to understand our institutions, our laws, our healthcare systems, those things have all been very interesting to me. And I think that as much of a time investment as I've taken, because this right now is going to be my 4th degree, it's worth it because I'm able to understand and be empathetic and be able to communicate a lot of these issues. So, but I think the optimism, I think, comes from not giving up. I don't know. There was just, I remember when I was back in Yale, and at first Yale did not want to give me any financial aid because I came from a relatively well-off family. But then that family broke up, and I was kind of left without resources. And I actually kind of learned, and I might have told your wife this, Paul, but I kind of learned finances, mostly because I had to find a way to pay for Yale.
Okay. So, good reason.
So when you're out there and you're like, oh God, I have to get a job that pays real money, and this tuition is no joke. And Yale had this kind of thing that was like a credit committee. So it was something that when I actually was going to in the banking world and having to present multi-million-dollar loan requests to a bunch of senior bankers and in what we called then a credit committee. I always, in my mind, always went back to those days at Yale when I was trying to like justify why they should let me come back and accept my whatever was in my checkbook to actually propel myself forward. But at the same time, I always had this, plan B that was in the back of my mind, because every time I had those meetings back at my alma mater, I was saying, well, I could take all this money and go to the Bahamas for a couple of months and just chill, and that would be really great. And maybe I'll just come back to school another time.
Oh, goodness.
But they never let me get away with it. I got back into school, graduated in 4 years, and then took a break before I went off to business school while I was working full time. And then about another 5-year break. And then I went to law school while I was working full time. And and then now, 20 years later, I'm working on my MPH. So I found those challenges, those things that just kind of push you down. But it's, as I was describing before, even in the HIV community, it's all about resiliency.
Okay, just to show that you are no different than anyone else, because you've done so much. You continue to do so many things. You're working, you're studying, degrees falling out of the sky. When you just shut it down and you get even away from AIDS awareness, what do? What's your downtime like?
I do have some hobbies.
Oh, you do? Okay, I just want to make sure now.
Yeah. I do like to read. I do like to do writing, like poetry. I have a book that I'm working on that is kind of it's a historical fiction on the first Black resident of Palm Springs named Lawrence Crossley, and what went on in Palm Springs back in the early 60s, which you wouldn't believe, but most people don't know these stories. It's important to have other things going on. The thing that keeps me going, I think, a lot of the times about Palm Springs, it's such a beautiful place to live. And honestly, when I used to live in New York and I would come out here on vacations, I could feel my blood pressure go instantly down by 30 points just after I got off the plane. So it's really a refreshing place to be, and you need to have places like that in your life. And I think for folks who feel that they're stressed, one of the least expensive things to do is probably find a local park and just understand that how nature affects us is something that we don't have any part of putting it together. It's just a miracle of existence, and it helps bring back the idea that there's something greater than ourselves that's out there that's kind of working on our lives.
Jax, I'm wondering, like every American, you now have lived through 2 years of the COVID pandemic. From your perspective, do these Venn diagrams intersect at any point between the now 4-decade, entering the 5th decade war against HIV and AIDS and what we have dealt with here? What are the similarities? What are the differences? What did we fail to learn culturally and scientifically and from a sociological standpoint? And what about this makes you just shake your head?
Well, the one thing that makes me shake my head is that the disparities in healthcare that we've all known about in Black and Brown communities still exist, and you can see it evidenced in the rates of COVID infections in Black and Brown communities, and the rates of vaccination as well. So It's an old story, but it's one that we're still working on. I think the fascinating thing is to see people like Anthony Fauci, who was so important during the initial years of the AIDS plague years, taking such a leadership role in COVID. And then I guess from some of the work that I do with other organizations that are more scientific in nature, it's heartening to know that a lot of the work that was done to advance HIV vaccines and HIV cure research actually helped in the COVID crisis. There were a lot of clinical trials networks that were set up to help fight HIV/AIDS that once COVID came around were just totally redirected their work towards finding the vaccines for COVID, and did so in like lightning speed. I mean, when you compare the fact that it took nearly a year and a half to come up with good vaccines for COVID, and it took nearly 15 years in the HIV/AIDS crisis before we had medications that could really reliably create a chronic condition. It's amazing what medicine can do. It's transformative.
Pitt, let me ask you this question.
Okay.
When we first got together and we're considering topics for the show, and I brought this one up, and it was immediate to me that this really hit a hot button with you and something that you felt very deeply about. And I'll tell you in a moment that it was intensely personal to me as well. What was your reaction, and why were you so adamant about making sure we address this?
Two things. One, because of COVID, I thought, well, what happened to AIDS research, HIV research? Like, why do we not speak about this enough? Why is it out of the news? That's what I personally felt. And then two, within the Black and brown communities, I was like, this has been a problem for a long time now. Too many families don't want to talk about it. Some of the clergy don't want to talk about this. I just felt like we're ignoring it. Maybe that's too harsh a word to use, ignore, but I just personally felt like we're putting this on the back burner.
We've lost focus at the
very
very least.
We have lost
at the
focus.
very least.
We have lost focus.
In my first phone conversation with Jax, he just bluntly asked me, has this affected you personally? And he's referenced the plague years. I lost a dear brother-in-law to AIDS, and it was shortly before the birth of my daughter, my only child. And it's particularly painful. My brother-in-law was such a magnificent human being. This was a good person. And the fact that my daughter never got to know her uncle, and he never got to know his niece, that hurts me and pains me to this day. And then I think about the pain that's magnified all over the country, all over the world. This is still a very important topic, Jax.
Well, thank you for bringing it up and putting some light on it, because it is you think about COVID and how we're focused on COVID, but it's really great that there's a public health discussion going on in this country. It's a little dicey for some folks, but really having it is so important, and it's going to help the HIV/AIDS movement in terms of really looking forward to some more technological advances in vaccines and cure research.
Can I say something real fast here? And that's a great point that Jax made there. At times, it's still a little dicey. I had a good friend in college who passed away a few years ago, and his family said he died of cancer. We found out after the fact he died of AIDS. And there were so many people that were disappointed because the family didn't want the general public, didn't want his close friends to know that was the reason, as if we were going to be ashamed, right? Or maybe they felt ashamed. And I know that's a stigma that I pray we can get out of one day, that we can just simply get away from that. Maybe, Jax, have you heard that story too often, something similar to that?
Yeah, and it's been a while really since that I think that some folks have really done that. And in all fairness to that family, we do really, really focus more on HIV as the disease. And so there might have been a cancer that was related to HIV/AIDS. So it's tough. I think we've gotten to the point where there's two sides to that coin. I mean, as for long-term survivors who felt like we fought for recognition based on a disease called AIDS, it's hard for us to really reconcile that maybe somebody didn't die necessarily of AIDS. So because there might have been more things going on. For example, I think the family might have been also concerned about whether or not there was some maybe the person that passed away had not come out of the closet, for example, or maybe there was related to a drug abuse problem that this person has experienced, which, having to say that somebody passed away from HIV/AIDS creates a whole lot of questions for that. It's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. The stigma is still there. I think I get more upset, though. There was a story I heard recently where there was a senior, a woman who was living with HIV, and she got a piece of mail that somebody had intercepted, and in it was some information that had something to do with an HIV organization that she was a part of. And then it turned out that there was rumors going around her senior living environment that there was somebody living there with AIDS. And it's just like, really? Because it brings you back to those old stories about, well, maybe we should be washing doorknobs, or, we shouldn't be, touching this person or something like that. And it's like, don't bring us back to those bad days, please. So it's a tough story, I think, with people who are passing away. I think, if it was a celebrity, like, remember the days when it was the old celebrities like Rock Hudson, who actually we all knew when he passed away he had AIDS. I think there was a rapper named Eazy-E. I think. I don't know if we knew that he actually died of AIDS, but it certainly came out later that he did die of AIDS. There's some people who think that Magic Johnson was cured of AIDS because he's still here with us. And whenever he is in the press, he explains to people, no, I'm still taking HIV medications. Yes, it's undetectable. I'm fine. Because now we can live to old age. But it's incredible, the stories that you hear that have no basis in truth, like Magic Johnson being cured. It's crazy.
Jax Kelly, you are a fascinating man.
Wow.
You have lived a fascinating life and will continue to. I can certainly understand now why my wife likes you way better than she likes me. And I want you to know this. We really appreciate this. And when you go on, as you will, and your interests change a little bit and you get your PhD in astrophysics, make sure to come back on this show
on the podcast
at Radically Rational.
Jax mentioned poetry. You said you write a little poetry. Is that poetry for you and your friends, or are you published?
I haven't published poetry. I've published, there was something that got published. Essays have been published. I had a kind of a vignette short story that's been published. I really haven't published any of my poetry.
Okay, I'm just curious. I think it'd be a good read. His poetry would be a good, very good read.
I have no doubt. And that will happen. He will accomplish that like he's accomplished everything else. Jax, thank you. Joe says hi.
Okay. Hi, Joe.
All the best, Jackson. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jax.
All right. Take good care.
Well,
you too.
Pitt, here's the thing. One of the things that Jax was talking about toward the end of the interview was, is there any interconnection or interrelation between the fight against HIV/AIDS and what we've been going through for the last 2 years with respect to the pandemic? And I'm sad to say the only intersection I really see is an equal amount of ignorance. And in both cases, these issues were polluted with raw partisan politics in both cases. And in both cases, one of the most volatile ingredients in the issue was rampant hatred.
Oh, yeah.
We just don't learn.
That's such a good point. And when we don't deal with the facts, when we don't stick just with the facts, they stray off into conspiracy theories.
Mm-hmm. And then people
And
then people who lack the political courage or the political will to stand up to that, let it happen, and thereby perpetuate it. And that's kind of why we're in the situation we're in.
I'm glad Jax talked about Magic Johnson there at the end, because I have heard so many times people say, "Well, he has money, so he's cured. He looks great.
Right.
He looks just like when he played. He looks healthy." No, he still has HIV.
Absolutely.
It has gone nowhere. Yeah, maybe he has the dollars to pay for some medication, but
Which, by the way, is still a factor.
yeah, that is.
I mean, there is some inequity there.
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's when we're talking about, national health care or some kind of health care that everyone can have, that the money necessary for you to be as healthy as possible. And unfortunately, it's an unequal. It's not even close to a balance. It's just unequal in this country.
Pitt, as always, thank you, and thank you for your contributions to radicallyrational.com. It's our favorite website, and we want it to be your favorite website. Go on over there. If nothing else, we want to make you smile. We deal with serious subject matter a lot, but we try to do so in a way that we don't take ourselves seriously. So check it out. We got daily videos. We have our entire archive of podcasts, the entire library of that. There's some interesting stuff there. We do a sports blog. Pitt and I are both sports guys.
Fanatics.
Absolutely. So we encourage you to do that. As always, we appreciate your being here, and we will see you next time on Radically Rational, the podcast.